I knew something was wrong the moment my British colleague leaned back, nodded slowly, and said, "Yeah, it's not bad." In America, those 4 words are emotional purgatory. Not good, not great, not safe. Just bad enough to make you rehearse apology speeches in your head. I smiled, nodded, and immediately started planning my professional disappearance. In my mind, alarms were blaring. Not bad meant disappointing. Disappointing meant regret. Regret meant I'd somehow ruined everything without realizing it. I replayed every sentence I'd written, every tone choice, every comma. Meanwhile, he looked perfectly calm, almost relaxed, like a man who had just delivered excellent news and was proud of his restraint. I later discovered that not bad was British praise, actual praise, high praise, the verbal equivalent of a standing ovation politely held inside the chest. No raised voice, no smile explosion, no enthusiastic reassurance, just quiet approval, delivered with the emotional volume set permanently to low. That was my first lesson in British politeness. What sounds cold, distant, or even insulting to American ears is often kindness wrapped in understatement. Brits aren't withholding enthusiasm to hurt you. They're doing it to avoid imposing feelings on you, which is thoughtful, allegedly. And this confusion doesn't stop at feedback. It follows Americans everywhere, into conversations, workplaces, queues, cafes, and moments so awkward you'll swear someone hates you, right before realizing they were being incredibly polite. And that realization usually arrives far too late for comfort and dignity. Before assuming anyone is rude, it helps to understand that Americans and Brits are playing 2 completely different politeness games, using the same language but following opposite rule books. In the United States, politeness is loud, visible, and reassuring. You smile, you explain, you soften every edge. You make sure the other person feels emotionally safe, validated, and absolutely certain you don't secretly hate them. In Britain, politeness works the other way around. It's quiet. It's restrained. It's built around not imposing yourself on anyone else. Feelings are kept contained, enthusiasm is rationed, and emotional volume is treated like something that should be adjusted down, not up. Being polite often means saying less, not more. So when Americans arrive, they bring warmth, clarity, and expressive reassurance. Brits respond with understatement, pauses, and careful phrasing. Both sides believe they are being considerate. Both sides believe the other is being strange. An American hears silence and thinks, "Why are they being distant?" A Brit hears enthusiasm and thinks, "Why are they doing so much?" The misunderstanding isn't about kindness. It's about intention versus interpretation. This is why Americans often leave British interactions thinking they've offended someone, failed socially, or been subtly insulted. And Brits walk away believing everything went perfectly well. No drama, no fuss, very polite. Once you understand this difference, everything starts to make sense. Emails, conversations, awkward pauses, and especially those moments where nothing seems wrong, yet somehow feels deeply uncomfortable, because politeness, it turns out, is cultural. And when cultures collide, even the nicest people can accidentally make each other miserable, and nowhere is this clearer than in the simplest interaction of all. A greeting that sounds friendly, harmless, and completely innocent, or so one side believes. The first time a Brit asked me, "All right," I answered honestly, that was my mistake. I paused, considered my emotional state, and said something like, "Honestly, a bit tired, but overall, pretty good. Busy week." The words were barely out before I noticed his face change, just slightly, like a man who had accidentally opened the wrong door. Because, "all right," wasn't a question. Not really. It was a greeting, a noise, a polite verbal nod. The correct response was, "all right," delivered back, immediately, with no additional information attached. Instead, I'd handed him my feelings. He nodded politely, eyes flicking around for an escape route. while I continued speaking, now painfully aware that something had gone wrong. The silence between my sentences grew longer. His responses grew shorter. Right. Yeah. Fair. In my head, panic set in. Panic. Had I overshared? Was I being annoying? Did he regret asking? Meanwhile, in his head, he was thinking, why is this happening to me at 8 in the morning? We parted politely, both convinced the interaction had been awkward for entirely different reasons. I walked away thinking I'd socially misstepped. He walked away thinking Americans talk a lot. That's the beauty of this clash. No one is angry. No one is offended. But both sides leave slightly unsettled, replaying the moment later. For Americans, silence feels like judgment. For Brits, silence feels like peace. And this misunderstanding doesn't just happen in greetings. It follows Americans into places where the stakes feel much higher, like work. Nothing terrifies an American faster than British feedback delivered calmly. A British manager once looked at a piece of work and said, "You might want to have a little look at this bit." To American ears, that sentence translates to, "This is bad. Fix everything. Possibly apologize." In the U.S., feedback is padded. Compliments come first. Encouragement follows. Criticism is softened, explained, and emotionally wrapped. In Britain, politeness means not embarrassing you, so the criticism arrives quietly, indirectly, and without emotional cushioning. When a Brit says, "It's interesting," Americans hear disappointment. When a Brit says, "I wouldn't necessarily do it that way," Americans hear condemnation. The absence of praise feels like failure. I once watched an American colleague rewrite an entire presentation overnight because their British supervisor said, "Yeah, it's fine." Fine, to Americans, is danger. Fine means unresolved. Fine means secretly not fine. The supervisor, meanwhile, thought the job was done well. Why would he exaggerate praise? That would be embarrassing. Excessive enthusiasm feels dishonest. Calm approval feels respectful. Both people went home confused. One was exhausted. The other was satisfied. Neither realized the other was interpreting politeness through a completely different lens. And if this misunderstanding feels intense at work, it only gets worse in public. Because once politeness meets queues, cafes, and strangers, things get painfully awkward. Put an American and a Brit in the same queue and watch politeness turn into psychological warfare. Americans fill silence instinctively. It feels kind, friendly, human. Brits endure silence politely, believing conversation with strangers is an imposition. I once started chatting in a queue about the weather, confident this was a safe topic. The Brit in front of me smiled politely and made a sound that was neither agreement nor encouragement. I continued anyway, determined not to make things awkward. It became awkward. Each sentence I offered was met with softer responses. Yeah. Right? I panicked internally. Was I annoying him? Was he annoyed? Was I missing a signal? He, meanwhile, was thinking, please let this queue move faster. In cafes, on buses, on trains, the same pattern repeats. Americans chat to be polite. Brits stay quiet to be polite. Both believe they are respecting boundaries. Both feel tension building. The worst part is that no one ever addresses it. Politeness prevents honesty. Americans don't want to seem rude by stopping. Brits don't want to seem rude by escaping, so the silence stretches. The small talk dies slowly. And both sides leave convinced the other was strange, intense, or cold. And yet, both were just trying to be nice. But politeness truly collapses when apologies enter the situation, because that's when everything breaks. Apologies are where British and American politeness collide at full speed. Americans apologize to acknowledge feelings. Brits apologize to smooth situations. The result is a confusing spiral where everyone says sorry and no one knows why. An American bumps into a Brit and says, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." The Brit replies, "Sorry," out of reflex. Now both feel responsible. Both apologize again. Neither believes the other's apology fully resolves anything. The American thinks they're upset, but hiding it. The Brit thinks, why are we still talking about this? I once apologized 3 times for something minor. The Brit smiled politely and said, it's fine. But the tone suggested it was very much not something that required further discussion. My continued apologies felt aggressive. His calm responses felt passive. This is the breaking point, when politeness itself becomes the problem, when kindness is misread as coldness and reassurance is misread as intensity. Both sides are trapped by good intentions. Neither wants to offend, neither wants to escalate. So the interaction ends politely, awkwardly, unresolved. And this is usually the moment Americans realize something important. No one hates them. No one was rude. They've simply been interpreting politeness using the wrong cultural subtitles. What makes all of this even more confusing is that Americans don't just experience British politeness as quiet. They experience it as unfinished, like a sentence that stops halfway through, leaving you to guess the ending. In American culture, politeness often means closing emotional loops. You reassure, you confirm. You make sure no one leaves uncertain. In Britain, leaving space is the polite thing. Closure feels unnecessary, sometimes even awkward. This difference becomes painfully clear in emails. American emails read like emotional essays. They begin with warmth, move into context, soften the request, reassure the reader, and end with gratitude. British emails, by comparison, feel surgical. Short greeting, clear request. Brief sign-off, nothing extra. To an American, this can feel abrupt, even cold. To a Brit, it feels efficient and respectful of time. An American sees kind regards and starts decoding tone like it's a breakup text. Why not best? Why not warm regards? Did I do something wrong? Meanwhile, the Brit is simply choosing the most neutral, polite option available and moving on with their day. This constant decoding is exhausting. Americans are trained to read between emotional lines. Brits are trained to trust what is said and not infer more than necessary. So Americans look for hidden meaning. Brits assume there is none. Both sides are wrong, but neither realizes it. The confusion deepens when humor enters the conversation. British humor is often dry, understated, and delivered without warning. Americans, accustomed to clearer signals, sometimes miss the joke entirely. A sarcastic remark delivered with a straight face sounds like criticism. A deadpan comment sounds serious. Brits assume the humor is obvious. Americans assume they've been insulted. I once laughed politely at a British joke I didn't understand, only to realize later it was a mild insult disguised as humor. The Brit thought I enjoyed it. I thought I'd survived it. Again, politeness saved the interaction while quietly sabotaging clarity. Then there's the issue of compliments. Americans compliment freely. It's social lubrication. You praise effort. You praise style. You praise personality. Brits are more selective. Compliments are meaningful because they're rare. Overdoing them feels insincere. So when Americans shower praise, Brits may feel uncomfortable, unsure how to respond without appearing arrogant. When Brits offer a compliment, Americans sometimes miss it entirely. That wasn't bad, doesn't register as praise. You did all right feels neutral. It'll do sounds dismissive. But in British terms, these phrases often signal genuine approval. The emotional gap isn't about intent, it's about translation. This becomes especially complicated in friendships. Americans bond through openness. Sharing feelings builds trust. Brits bond through shared experiences and time, not emotional disclosure. Silence together can mean closeness. For Americans, silence often signals distance. So Americans push for connection while Brits pull back politely, each convinced the other is slightly off. Even conflict avoidance looks different. Americans address issues directly, often framing honesty as kindness. Brits avoid confrontation to preserve harmony, believing restraint is considerate. When Americans push for resolution, Brits feel pressured. When Brits avoid the topic, Americans feel dismissed. Politeness blocks resolution on both sides. At some point, Americans begin to question themselves. Did I talk too much? Did I misread something? Did I offend them? Brits, meanwhile, wonder why Americans seem anxious. Everything seemed fine. No one raised their voice. No one complained. What's the problem? The answer is that politeness has different goals. American politeness aims for emotional clarity. British politeness aims for emotional containment. One prioritizes expression, the other prioritizes restraint. Neither is superior. They simply evolved under different social pressures. Understanding this doesn't mean abandoning your instincts. Americans don't need to stop being warm. Brits don't need to start over-explaining. It just means recognizing that when something feels off, it may not be personal. It may be cultural. Once Americans realize that British calm doesn't equal disapproval, interactions become easier. Once Brits realize that American enthusiasm isn't fake, conversations feel less overwhelming. Awareness creates patience. Patience reduces misinterpretation. The irony is that both cultures pride themselves on being polite. Both value kindness. Both want to avoid offending others. And yet, they frequently offend each other accidentally by being polite in the way they know best. This is why so many cross-cultural misunderstandings linger. No one says anything. Everyone remains courteous. And the awkwardness quietly survives the interaction, living rent-free in someone's mind for years. Eventually, Americans learn to stop panicking at silence. Brits learn to tolerate enthusiasm. A mutual understanding forms. Not because politeness changed, but because interpretation did. And that's when these moments stop being stressful and start being funny. You laugh about the email you overanalyzed. You joke about the compliment you missed. You realize the silence wasn't judgment. It was peace. At that point, politeness stops being a barrier and becomes a story. A shared one you tell later, laughing, once the confusion has faded and the cultural subtitles have finally synced. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. British politeness isn't emotional distance, it's emotional respect. American politeness isn't fake enthusiasm, it's emotional clarity. Both are sincere. Both are well-intentioned. The problem isn't behavior, it's interpretation. We assume our version of politeness is universal. When it isn't reflected back, we feel rejected. Brits assume silence is comfortable. Americans assume silence is uncomfortable. Brits assume understatement shows sincerity. Americans assume enthusiasm shows honesty. Neither is right, neither is wrong. They're just different languages using the same words. Understanding this doesn't eliminate awkwardness, but it does soften it. You stop personalizing silence. You stop fearing calm feedback. You realize not bad might be a compliment, and fine might actually mean fine. And once you understand that politeness wears different disguises, the confusion turns into curiosity. The awkward moments become stories, and the misunderstandings stop feeling like failures and start feeling like cultural comedy. If you've ever left a conversation convinced someone disliked you, only to later discover they thought everything went perfectly, I need you to tell me. Brits, explain your politeness. Americans, defend your enthusiasm. Europeans, feel free to judge both of us. Drop your most awkward cross-cultural moments in the comments, because I promise, someone else has lived it too. And if this made you rethink an interaction you're still replaying in your head, you're not alone.